Hi, my name is Sara Hudson and I'm a Research Fellow at the Centre for Independent Studies. I'm here to talk about my latest report, Panacea to Prison, Justice Reinvestment in Indigenous Communities. The high Indigenous incarceration rate has elicited a long list of so-called solutions over the years. Since the 1991 Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, countless reports and programs have aimed to reduce Indigenous incarceration, but the number of Aboriginal people in custody has continued to rise, from 14% in 1991 to 27% in 2012. The latest so-called solution to high Indigenous incarceration and the focus of my report is justice reinvestment. Justice reinvestment is a concept from the United States, which proposes redirecting money spent on prisons into communities with high levels of offending and incarceration. Justice reinvestment involves 3 steps. The first step is gathering data on offending in the criminal justice system. The second step is using that data to create justice maps, areas which show the greatest concentration of offenders. The third step is redirecting those funds from corrective services to implement programs in targeted locations with high numbers of offenders to reduce their offending, and also then evaluating the effectiveness of those programs. The underlying premise of justice reinvestment, to build communities rather than prisons, has proven seductive, and many countries are now applying or investigating justice reinvestment strategies. Australia is the latest country to consider adopting justice reinvestment, with the Australian Senate announcing in November last year an inquiry into the value of a justice reinvestment approach in Australia, with a particular focus on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander offenders in prison. Advocates of justice reinvestment in Australia have been quick to highlight the success stories from overseas, but a number of important differences exist between Australia and the United States, which needs to be considered if Australia is going to adopt justice reinvestment. In the United States, 3/4 of offenders are given custodial sentences, whereas in Australia, only 1/5 of sentences imposed are custodial. This means that the United States has a lot more room to manoeuvre, a lot more people to keep out of prison than Australia does. A key feature of justice reinvestment in the United States is the devolution of power from state to local authorities. But in Australia, criminal justice is already the responsibility of state and territory governments, and it's highly unlikely that this responsibility will be devolved to local government councils. Advocates of justice reinvestment claim it saves money, but in all the states in the United States where justice reinvestment strategies have been applied, prisons may have closed, but correction service budgets have continued to grow. In the United Kingdom, justice reinvestment approaches seem to be accompanied by a parallel rise in the prison population. Justice reinvestment appears to recycle familiar old preventative community-based programs, but just in a new wrapping. The localised community-focused approach characteristic of justice reinvestment is already a feature of Aboriginal community justice groups which exist in New South Wales and the Northern Territory and Queensland. Justice reinvestment supporters have yet to explain how their approach will be any different or an improvement on existing community justice programs. Following the 1991 Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, crime prevention policies for Aboriginal people have focused on culturally appropriate or culturally secure approaches, such as the circle sentencing and the Koori and Murray courts, where Aboriginal offenders are brought before community elders for sanctioning. Yet such initiatives have merely tinkered with aspects of the criminal justice system and have not addressed the underlying reasons why Aboriginal people are offending. In the fight against Indigenous disadvantage and incarceration, justice reinvestment threatens to become a distraction from focusing on the fundamental reasons such as education and employment that will lead to change. Zero employment among 35% of the Aboriginal population plays a critical role in the high rates of Indigenous incarceration, with unemployed Indigenous people 20 times more likely to be in prison than employed Indigenous people. In fact, unemployment has been found to be a greater risk factor for offending than Indigenous status. Education and employment may not sound as novel or as exciting as justice reinvestment, but as evidence shows, they play a critical role in the high Indigenous incarceration rate. Improving educational outcomes should not be reliant on the diversion of funds from prison services, but a basic right that states and territories should be covering in their education budgets.